Good evening. I'm Terry Harpold, Associate Professor of English at the University of Florida and Director of UF's Imagining Climate Change Initiative. I would like to welcome you to the second in a series of Fall 2020 webinars on global cultural environmental justice, transdisciplinary, and transcultural perspectives. The series is co-sponsored by Imagining Climate Change, or ICC, and the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or SONGS, which is directed by my UF colleague, Will Hastie, the Waldo W. Neckirk Professor of German Studies and co-director of the UF Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. The focus of the series is on fundamental challenges and opportunities presented to us in this historical moment of acute planetary, environmental, political, and health crisis. How do we foster? How do we sustain? How do we recover economic, cultural, and social justice under conditions of ecological instability, global pandemic, and savage assaults, even within notionally democratic nations, on the rights of those who have been dispossessed by virtue of their race, gender, indigeneity, and class? It has never been clearer that environmental recovery and resistance, which is essential to the survival of our civilization, can only be accomplished in tandem with the recovery and resilience of justice, which is essential to the survival of our spirits. To help open a wider UF conversation on these vital questions, we have brought together 4 invited guest speakers and 4 faculty from the University of Florida in this series. They have extensive and diverse expertise in anthropology, economics, history, journalism, political science, religion, and environmental activism. The first webinar in this series, last week, focused on the long arc of the environmental imaginary and environmental justice in China, from the pre-modern period to the present day. Tonight's webinar addresses the accelerating catastrophe, under the guise of modernization and free market reforms, of ecological destruction and genocidal violence in the nation of Brazil. Upcoming webinars in the series, next Tuesday and Thursday, October 27th and 29th, will focus on challenges facing a workable Green New Deal in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and on the roles of women in frontline communities of color who are pressing for racial and climate justice along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. Additional information about these talks, the speakers, and the event schedules and Zoom links are available from the Imagining Climate Change and Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies websites. All of the events are free and open to the public. No advance registration is necessary. The webinars are being recorded for subsequent asynchronous streaming if you cannot attend in real time. We encourage you to alert friends, colleagues, and especially students who may be interested in these subjects but who could not attend tonight to this option. In the month of November, SONGS and ICC are also coordinating a global cultural environmental justice poetry slam with numerous prize categories for single author and collaborative submissions and submissions in 1 or more languages. The Poetry Slam has been made possible by the generosity of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany as part of their ongoing Campus Weeks initiative. Winners of the contest will be announced and will perform their poetry at the Slam Grand Finale on the evening of November 9th, the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Poetry Slam submissions are due this coming Sunday, October 25th by midnight. See the SONGS website for details. Now, before I introduce our guest speakers, a few words about the process of tonight's webinar. Our principal speaker and her respondent will talk for about an hour in total, perhaps a little more. This will be followed by an open question and answer portion of the evening, giving you the opportunity to address them directly and to extend our conversations. You may be unfamiliar with Zoom's built-in question and answer feature. It's the little Q&A button near the bottom of the application window. Feel free to post questions for the speakers at any time during the webinar. I'll be keeping track of them and will queue them up for both speakers at the end of the evening. I may sometimes group several questions on related themes into a single inquiry to the speakers in the interest of time. You may post your questions using your name or anonymously. Your preference in this regard will be respected. Other attendees cannot see your questions until I read them back to the speakers. So let's begin. I'm honored to introduce to you our first guest speaker for tonight, Andréa Zhouri, whose talk is entitled The Rise of Anti-Environmentalism in Brazil, From Deregulation to Institutional Dismantling. Andréa Zhouri is professor in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, where she founded the group in environmental studies and coordinated the team that created the undergraduate track in socio-environmental sciences. She has long researched topics related to socioeconomic conflicts and environmental inequalities. An active member of several environmental networks and scientific associations, including the Brazilian Association of Anthropology, she has published widely on mining, large dams, environmental conflicts, and environmental deregulation in Brazil. Professor Zhouri's talk will be followed by a response by Simone Ataide, Associate Professor in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies and a faculty member of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center of Florida International University. Until early 2020, Professor Ataide was a much valued faculty colleague here at UF in the Center for Latin American Studies. We miss her very much, and I'm truly pleased to be able to bring her back, if only virtually, for this event. Professor Ataide is an environmental anthropologist and interdisciplinary ecologist who has worked across the Amazonian region for over 20 years, supporting indigenous peoples and local communities' self-determination and sustainable livelihoods, as well as biocultural and territorial rights. Thank you in advance for joining us here tonight. We expect a lively, engaging, and moving discussion. And now I'll turn things over to Andréa Zhouri.
Okay. Good evening. It's a great honor to be here tonight, participating in this web seminar. And I'd like to thank the organizers and co-organizers, Imagining Climate Change and Sustainable Development Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, both initiatives by the University of Florida, for this opportunity. I'll share my screen here with you. A moment. Okay. I believe that the difficult situation that the Brazilian society is going through at the moment is already known to many, at least in general terms. The international media has shown the increasing number of people infected by coronavirus in Brazil, at the same time as it has also been addressing the alarming fires in the Amazon and Pantanal. Images of fire, animal suffering, traditional communities being evicted from their lands, indigenous people murdered or going sick, make up an apocalyptic panorama that inevitably makes me travel back in time some 30 to 40 years ago, back to the 1980s, when the images of the burning forest, the Amazon, caught the world's imagination. Oops, moment, a little problem here. Oh, okay, here we go. This is a cover page of Time at the time, in 1989. A world that also listened to the testimonies of Chico Mendes, José Lutzenberger, Chief Raoni, and also the singer Sting at the time, among so many others involved in the fight to save the forest. This decade became known as the Decade of Destruction and was thus framed in a series filmed by Adrian Cowell, a British historian and documentary filmmaker. It is important thus to remember from the beginning that this decade of destruction also generated a social environmentalist movement, such as the Alliance of Forest People and the resistance movement to the Belo Monte Dam. I could evoke so many other images of this time, as for instance, that of the Indian Tuira, with her machete positioned in the face of the Eletronorte's representative, or that of Ailton Krenak's speech at the National Congress in 1986, not by accident, he's a writer now, not by accident, so often recalled today as his current writings, urges to dream and create ways to postpone the end of the world. Hence, I start with these positive remarks because I believe it is necessary to bear in mind the history of struggle and resistance which launched a kind of environmentalization of the state, an environmentalization of society in Brazil, a process that bequeathed to us relevant unfoldings as the significant chapters of the 1988 Constitution concerned with the environment and indigenous people's rights. Indeed, Article 231 of the 1988 Constitution reads, "It is recognized to indigenous peoples their social organization, their customs, language, beliefs, traditions, and the original rights over lands they traditionally occupy, belonging to the Union, that is to the state, to demarcate them, to protect and enforce respect for all their assets." Also, chapters on the environment as chapter 225, chapter 6, article 225, which says everyone has the right to an ecologically balanced environment, a good for the common use of the people, and essential to a healthy quality of life, imposing on the public power and collectivity the duty to defend it and preserve it for present and future generations. There is also a special chapter on the Amazon, the Pantanal, and the other biomes in Brazil. Therefore, it is important to realize the existence of this double movement in works of memory. On the one hand, the remembrance of the destructive forces of the past, which seem to haunt our present, and on the other hand, the movements of resistance that have produced and inspired countless initiatives that represent the struggle for social and environmental justice in Brazil today. But I believe the majority of the Brazilian people were astonished by the statements bluntly made by the Brazilian Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, who at the ministerial meeting of April 22 openly suggested to take advantage of the pandemic to speed up changes in environmental rules, environmental regulations, with ordinary measures, decrees, among other tricks. The position is crystal clearly anti-environmental. At the same ministerial meeting, the Minister of Education also made open his hatred for the expression indigenous peoples. He repeated the word hate for 3 times without causing any reaction from the other ministers at the same meeting. The Minister of Education fell, while the Minister of the Environment remains firmly in his mission, which has not been exactly that of environmental protection. But how have we arrived at this current scenario, where statements and initiatives so frankly against the environment and indigenous peoples are placed in daylight by those in charge of these issues? I'd like to develop my talk here, my ideas, in 2 parts, in 2 moments. Firstly, by identifying some of the domestic roots of anti-environmental and anti-indigenous discourses, especially among the military and regional oligarchies. And secondly, by analyzing in a more global scale how liberal environmentalism, the environmentalism of sustainable development, have paved the way for the rise of anti-environmentalism. Well, in the early 1990s, anti-environmental positions were voiced by the military and regional politicians while the country was going through a growing debate on sustainable development. The anti-environmental discourses seemed, therefore, anachronistic in the face of the changes of the world. These changes were well represented by the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and other economic, and cultural frontiers, which together with technological innovations in communication increased the imagination of the world as a single or a unique global place. In this context, a global event such as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, was perceived by the military and local politicians as a major international conspiracy to occupy the Amazon. There was then a marriage, so to speak, between the military concern with national sovereignty, which implied the territorial control of the Amazon, and the interests of rural oligarchy and multinational corporations, which intended to appropriate Amazonia for capitalist accumulation. Accusations against environmentalists were well registered by the press at the time. The military accused environmentalists of being internationalists and non-patriotic, enemies of the nation, while environmentalists responded by holding the military responsible for international economic investments in the Amazon since 1970s, during the dictatorship. Former Army Secretary Leônidas Pires stated, for instance, that he felt for José Lutzenberger, the environmental secretary at the time, the same hate he felt for the communist leader Luiz Carlos Prestes. José Lutzenberger, the comparison between José Lutzenberger, a well-known Brazilian environmentalist who played an important role in denouncing and even stopping World Bank's projects in the Amazon in the late 1980s, and Luiz Carlos Prestes, the head of the Communist Party in Brazil for many decades, exemplifies how environmentalists gradually replaced communists as enemies of the nation in the eyes of the military between the late 1980s and the early 1990s. At a symposium held in October 1991, two national army bodies, SEBRE and ESEMI, produced a document aimed at raising public opinion against the Rio Summit. In geopolitical sense, the document identifies both internal and external enemies around the issue of the environment. As Gilberto Mestrinho, governor of the state of Amazonas at the time, points out, there is an industry, I quote, there's an industry of mystification making us believe that we cannot cut down the trees because of the fragility of the Amazon ecosystem. Why do they spread such myths? Because it comprises the biggest mineral area in the world. Hence, immediately in the second half of the 60s and strongly in the 70s, Brazil was invaded by a campaign for the preservation of the Amazon. Exactly for what purpose? Because the rich mineral resources of the Amazon compete with the investments that developed countries have in other parts of the world. Finish quote. On the indigenous question, the same document sums up the position of the military. SEBRES, I quote, SEBRES is against the radical preservation of the Aboriginal culture and the formation of cysts in areas not proportionally related to the number of silvicolas. And I highlight here the words cysts as a cancerigenousnous cell within the nation, so to speak, and the word silviculus, which means the inhabitants of the jungle, which is a word that really deprived the indigenous peoples of their culture and their status as social subjects. In 1993, there was a Yanomami massacre in the borders with Venezuela. Asked about his belief in the thesis of internationalization of the Amazon, the army minister at the time, Zenildo Lucena, stated, "This is our concern. The wealth of the Amazon leads us to these concerns. There is a great interest in the area. It is the largest mineral reserve in the world, as the permanent presence of miners indicates. the question of the Yanomami nation is very dangerous. The nation is the Brazilian one. We need to be cautious. There is the case of Bosnia to prove it. So we can perceive here the concern with the idea of nation that could provide, for example, elements for a separatist movement to arise in Brazil. Now, moving on to the following decade, now to the year 2001, a series of reports revealed the existence of a military headquarters in Marabá, in the state of Pará. Secret army documents disclosed to the public spying practices thought to be extinguished during with the end of the military dictatorship. Social movements, unions, political parties, NGOs were all classified in these documents as adverse forces. To defeat these forces, the military assumed possible infringements of rights. In 2008, public debate escalated again due to the conflicts between farmers and the indigenous peoples of the Raposa Serra do Sol Reserve on the border again with Venezuela. After a struggle that lasted for about 3 decades, the Raposa Serra do Sol indigenous land was established, despite protests from landowners and politicians in the region. Rice producers who arrived in Roraima through colonization programs implemented by the federal government, together with the military and other political elites, never accepted this land demarcation. The 2008 debate on this land issue is very similar to what had happened before in the 1990s concerning the Yanomami's lands. For instance, the headline of a weekly magazine called Isto É stated, the Amazon, its sovereignty is in question. Proposals for the internationalization of Brazil's greatest green treasure gain momentum in the global community. An immediate answer is necessary, end of quote. Again, the use of the word nation as reference to indigenous groups and identities is severely criticized, as in the following comments of Arnaldo Jabor in a leading TV news show, Jornal Nacional from Globo TV. Are there indigenous nations other than the Brazilian nation? There is malicious madness in the country dividing us into various nations, Indian, Black, non-Brazilian. This favors the swindling NGOs, both international and national, who profit from the division in terms of money and control, end of quote. So the anti-environmentalist and anti-indigenous discourse evoke threats to national sovereignty, equating for this purpose the dimensions of geographic space, territory, place, and nation in opposition to ethnic, cultural plurality. It is a project of nation-state averse to difference and diversity. Nationalist when it comes to issues such as in the environment, environmental issues and indigenous rights, but internationalist when related to economic exploitation of natural resources. I have selected these excerpts to show, in a way, the historic balance of anti-environmental and anti-indigenous positions in our society since the 1980s and 1990s, when the country's re-democratization coincided with globalization processes, such as the growing debate on sustainable development. However, if on the one hand, the identification of the roots of these anti-environmental and anti-indigenous positions in conservative segments of Brazilian society helps us to understand the discourses brought to light today by actors socialized in the same institutions, like President Jair Bolsonaro himself, who is a former army person. On the other hand, the concreteness of these anti-environmental positions must also be understood within a wider context, that of neoliberal and neo-development policies that, by embracing a certain global environmental perspective, that of ecological modernization and sustainable development, paved the way for today's environmental deregulation and institutional dismantling. Therefore, my analysis shall turn now to some of these aspects. I identified the current policies of environmental dismantling as a kind of bare violence, as opposed to a previous political period marked by a new developmentalism in which environmental deregulation was gradually conducted in a kind of a slow violence, to use a term suggested by Rob Nixon. Under slow violence, especially since the 1990s, the country has been gradually delaying the demarcation of indigenous lands, indigenous territories, and the lands of traditional communities in the same proportion that it has opened new territories for the advance of soybeans, sugarcane, eucalyptus plantations, and large-scale mining, among other types of commodities. We have witnessed the increase of conflict in environmental protection areas, while infrastructural projects such as large dams and large-scale mining have their environmental impact assessment granted with high numbers of conditionalities, mitigating and compensating measures which are never met. All of this operating within the good governance global regime and the democratic rule of law in Brazil under governments identified as progressive. This is how, in my view, the slow violence paved the way for the rise of anti-environmentalism, a position once restricted to sectors of society within lobbies in parliament that now stand at the center of state power. But how this came to be? Well, back to the 1990s, two global political regimes somehow merge, one subsuming the other. The Rio Earth Summit in 1992 may represent the sustainable development regime, whereas the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1993 seals the Washington Consensus and the economic agenda. Gradually, the WTO regime encapsulated the environmental agenda, already well managed by the World Bank at the time, with its conditionalities for loans to developing countries. Sustainable development became a mantra central to the idea of good governance. It represented, in fact, a compromise between capital and environmental critique, making possible the apparent consensus between the two agendas, the environmental on the one hand and the liberal economic on the other hand. Environmental management became central to the idea of sustainable development and its ecological modernization paradigm. This paradigm was built around market solutions, technological efficiency, and political consensus. Therefore, emphasis was given to the so-called participation principle, such as stakeholder processes, public hearings in environmental impact assessment, and so on. Nevertheless, the management approach underlined an agenda of initiatives that proved to be more focused on techniques and procedures than on political purposes and projects committed to social change and environmental justice. In contrast to this liberal environmentalism embraced by corporations, state, and hegemonic NGOs, and a few researchers, academics, environmental justice movements, that is social environmentalism, raises the issue of environmental inequality, environmental racism, leading to a diverse range of proposals for social environmental changes. Several movements have joined the resistance of those directly facing deforestation in large projects in the Amazon and other parts of the country. alliances were made between environmentalists, indigenous and traditional peoples organizations. However, political efforts to build a vigorous consensus through participation principles confused the direction of the critique at first, especially during the 1990s. It became increasingly evident that participation, the democratic principle under ecological modernization, presented itself, in fact, as a late and misleading process. For instance, in the context of environment impact assessment, participation is limited to the debate about compensation and mitigation of the effects of large dams, of large projects, that is, to the environmental consequences of such projects. There is no room for participation in the decision-making process. There is little space for participation about territorial planning. This is something that should indeed precede environment impact assessment. Participation, as I have bear witness for 30 years now, is usually disciplined by subtle mechanisms of negotiation and production of acceptance, a pacification of dissent, or domestication of social environmental conflicts. A sort of coercive harmony, to put in Lotta Nader's terms, is taking place. Strategies for involving local people in these alleged democratic initiatives is filled with manipulation and cooptation. Locals are rarely represented by the most critical voices on the ground. Even researchers and well-intended academics may find support within such initiatives, often financed by World Bank and think tanks. However, the agenda of social environmental movements comprising principles of equity and of environmental justice, dimensions that imply, among others, the debate on land tenure and territorial distribution, remained absent from this hegemonic environmental agenda. Although similarly participative, there has been an increase in slow violence. Symbolic violence is aligned to material violence as the loosening of regulatory norms and procedures, along with pre-existing inefficiency in law enforcement, frequently open up space for insidious actions to emerge. Forced displacement and displacement in situ often go hand in hand with human rights violations, including the right to things such as information, potable water, and freedom of movement, as it has happened in new mining areas in Minas Gerais. This is a photo of a public hearing, very democratic, participative public hearing for a mining project in Minas Gerais, Anglo-Americans mining project. But even within this context, liberal environmentalism and its technical solutions based on capital, bureaucracy, and science, built in a complex way to theoretically overcome environmental decline, has generated a high social and financial cost for investors and business elites. Motivated or justified by successive economic crises, the international capital has invested in building up a consensus around the so-called flexibilization or the loosening of environmental procedures, such as the environmental impact assessment. Since 2004, for example, we have seen the emergence in Brazil of a set of initiatives promoted by business groups, strongly articulated with representatives of the parliament, which ended up by proposing a draft constitutional amendment to change the overall rule for environment impact assessment. This has been pointed out as one of the main villains, the environment impact assessment, the main barrier, the main villain to the country's economy, economic growth, the country's development. A study conducted by the World Bank in 2008 appears as the spearhead of the escalating debate for deregulation in Brazil. The deregulation movement is in full swing with an agenda of proposals for the systematic revision of numerous other laws and norms created from the 1988 Constitution and, in many cases, even earlier, in earlier times, such as the Forest Code, the Mining Code, the Water Code, and many others involving the interests of agribusiness and the mining corporations. All of these taking place under the worldwide ideology of good governance and within the democratic rule of law, which maintained active the principle of participation in the form of a wide range of social councils, most of them now extinguished or reduced. More than 600 organs of popular participation were extinguished or reduced by a decree in 2019, last year. From March to May this year, during the pandemic, the federal government edited 195 acts related to the environment, 195 acts. In 2019, in the same period, only 16 acts were edited. Besides, the military have replaced technical personnel in many environmental agencies, state agencies. So the context today is one of violence without disguise. And my argument is that the utopia centered on the so-called win-win solutions, which marked previous governments, paved the way for open anti-environmentalism, which is also a racist anti-environmentalism. This is noticeable not only in deregulation policies, but also in the dismantling of state institutions. And very noticeable on the ground. The number of indigenous leaders killed in 2019 was the highest in 11 years. Of the 27 people killed in land conflicts in Brazil, 7 were indigenous. The vulnerability of indigenous peoples to COVID-19 is alarming. Government representatives speak out about the elimination of activism and call environment institutions fine factories. Accusations that foster an environment of disrespect for the environmental laws and environmental enforcement, along with an increase in deforestation and criminal fires, especially in the Brazilian Amazon. So the pressure to regulate mining, oil and gas production and energy generation on indigenous lands is intensifying. Several bills have been submitted to Congress, such as Bill 191 and Bill 2633, both tempting at the commodification of indigenous lands and forests. Meanwhile, the good governance believers are still committed to Green New Deal, to the building of the new Green New Deal, represented perhaps by certification schemes, for instance, devoted to promote what they call sustainable dams in the Amazon or responsible mining in the Amazon. Well, to conclude, policies that slide between deregulation and environmental dismantling make us wonder about a possible reshaping of the state, the Brazilian state at the present. The bare violence of today increases the ecological debt, deepens the gap of environmental injustice, and threatens constitutional rights. But it also clashes with global liberal environmentalism, which since the 1990s has developed disciplinary devices as subtle forms of domination, technologies for controlling dissent, like the ones open to participation as acceptance, such as World Bank's good governance principles. These are things, in fact, that do not cause any damage to the self-image of the West as a civilized world. France and Germany, for instance, have already expressed concern about the increase of deforestation in the Amazon and announced restrictions for the intended trade between the European Union and the Mercosur in case Brazil doesn't act to curb deforestation. So finally, I close with a few questions for us. Would bare violence be sustainable for business in a world where values such as modernity, civilization, and democracy still prevail? Was it not precisely in the name of democracy and modernity that slow violence was instituted through the peacemaking process of dissent? To what extent will these values dear to the Western system of domination be discharged and replaced by others, sustaining a more brutal strand of world neoliberalism? Are we all facing now a new mode of liberalism? Something like a necro-liberalism and the rise of a necro state, to have a dialogue here with Mbembe? If so, what would be the symbolic basis for its justification today? What would be the social and legal basis for its legitimacy and legality? As an alternative, would the Green New Deal be strong enough to really stop climate change? Or will it rather foster sustainable colonization over territories of traditional communities which have already an undoubtful better record in climate issues? These are issues that, in my view, challenge us all in respect to our present and our future. There are issues to which many social environmental movements and local communities have engaged with, not only in their daily struggle to survive, but also in their vision of the future and of a better world. River, forest, and savanna dwellers point to the construction of a collective model of self-determination, which is emancipatory and decolonized, based on a diverse range of cosmologies and singular relationships with nature. We have much to learn by engaging ourselves with such movements, such as Pachamama, the ideas of Pachamama, the idea of Buen Viver, ideas that come from the Andes, that come from Bolivia now for us, that could inspire us in our voting system, perhaps. Of course, anthropologists and academics like ourselves, who are immersed in this same planet, are also challenged to practice an active and responsible science, firmly engaged with ethical, epistemic, and political positions. Here I share with you some of my views, hopes, and commitment to equity and environmental justice, and along with principles related to freedom of mind, of speech, and of knowledge production. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'm going to turn the screen over now to Simone Ataidi to give a reply to this, frankly, stunning and quite moving presentation. The floor is yours, Simone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Andrea. That was, I would say, incredible. I really enjoyed listening to your talk, and the questions you posed in the end. I think we need to go back to them and try to address them. And it's very important for reflection on the moment that I think we are all going through globally. In Brazil, very critical, but also in many other places that are facing the same challenges. In Latin America and out of Latin America. I'm here in the US, and the US is no different. So we can trace many parallels. I have a short presentation here, in which I'm trying to connect what's happening in Brazil with the kind of the compromises that the Brazil government assumed with the Paris Agreement, that's a signatory of the Paris Agreement, and try to connect a little bit also with climate change. And then I have some connections also with social environmental justice and some of the points that Andrea touched on her presentation that I would like us to go back in the end in the questions and answers to address and to look at those questions in more detail. I was very interested. So I'm going to share my screen here with all of you. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. Yes. Can you see it? You see my screen?
You're good.
Okay, great. Let me start presenting here. It was something like okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about the anti-environmentalism and the politicization of climate change. The losers are all of us, right? And how does all of this matter to you? The kind of the brilliant presentation and the Andrea's historical overview of what we went through in Brazil historically. And it looks like the times keep repeating, time keeps repeating itself through history. And things that we passed and in the 80s and 70s keep coming back, and how we deal with these new moments. So it's kind of something for us to reflect also. I always like to think that we live in a commons world, that we share so many things in common. We share humanity, we share the atmosphere, we share every breath we take, we are sharing with each other, right? And we belong to the planet, and the planet is not like the contrary, that the planet belongs to us, but we belong into the planet. And knowing that it's a very, very delicate system, that we are changing in very fundamental ways. The system, the whole atmosphere that is very thin, and that allow us to breathe and to communicate and to live and for the planet to have life. It's very thin and it's very delicate. So it's a delicate balance that we are changing in fundamental ways in this new era, which is called the Anthropocene. I just brought this graph to show that, of course, a lot of the emissions that are changing our thin atmosphere in very fundamental ways coming from the energy that we use in our everyday lives, but also from, and the second one globally is agriculture, forestry, and land use. And this is very important when we talk about Brazil, because the deforestation that we are now witnessing that is growing since the Bolsonaro government took place in 2019 and 2020, we're seeing like a spike in deforestation. And this has implications that go beyond, that are beyond Brazil. Here you can see the Latin America greenhouse emissions. Brazil is the country that in Latin America is the champion in emissions, of course, because of its size and the size of the population. But you could think that energy is the one, like the sector that has most emissions. But in fact, it's land use change and forestry and deforestation that matters the most in terms of the emissions in Brazil. You can see here this graph that shows the change on land use and land cover change and how it is important for the greenhouse emissions. And if tropical tree cover loss was a country, it would come third after only China and United States in the carbon dioxide emissions. So just tying what is going on, what is happening in the Amazon with like the global climate system as well. We are signatory of the Paris Agreement, and under this Paris Agreement, we have many targets that Brazil needs to meet in 2025, some in 2030. And then these are very ambitious targets, and some of them are here. I'm not going to read all of them. You can look later in the presentation, but right now we are insufficient. We are categorized as insufficient in this trend of the emissions. We are right here in the graph. The US, you guess what? It is critically insufficient, okay? The trajectory of the US is critically insufficient. And as you know, the country dropped out of the Paris Agreement. So the current trajectory, it's going in the wrong direction. So you know what Andrea was talking about, the dismantling of the environmental institutions and regulations, that it's happening now. Public instances and committees for public participation, more than 600 were extinct, 195 acts against the environment. So all of this is going against the flow and is going against the targets that Brazil also agreed and compromised in the Paris Agreement. And some of them are here. So things from climate change denial, so it's not real, and still, you know, denying and kind of disputing if climate change is really happening, to reduce budget for monitoring and law enforcement. So a lot of like budgetary cuts as well in this dismantling, part of the dismantling. Environmental agencies are being restructured or changing personnel, and the militarization that Andrea also referred to. We also have problems now with lack of data transparency. In addition to fake news and fake data and data that is fabricated, we also have the problem of lack of data transparency policies in Brazil. Decrease of instances of civil society participation, we already talked about that. And then some of the funds that the country should be using to address climate change and to address Amazonian development from the ground up, right? In contrast or in conflict with what Andrea was referring as this like a top-down or coming from outside models of development, but the real like development from the cultural roots of the Amazon and the social biodiversity in the Amazon. So these funds have been paralyzed and even have plans to be applied in other activities that are not the ones that are most responsible for climate change, for example, in the case of the Climate Fund, and ended up in lawsuits that were now against the Brazilian government, and they were put against the Brazilian government in the Supreme Court public hearings that I'm gonna talk in a little bit. So deforestation and fire is going hand in hand. This is just for you to have an idea, put a map here that you can see the role of indigenous lands and protected areas in creating this buffer against destruction and deforestation. But it's hard to maintain the buffer if you don't have the policies, if you have violence against indigenous peoples, as Andrea was mentioning, and you have the dismantling of the institution. So it's really hard to resist under this like path that we are now in the country. Here you can see the fires, you can see the very, very steep increase of fires in the Pantanal, this very important, unique ecosystem wetlands that we have in Brazil in 2019 and 2020. And here in this graph, you see that deforestation is starting to go up, to increase again after a period of successful control of deforestation in the previous governments, which successful programs were not adopted by the current government. Here you have also all the, we call it like services, but all the benefits, all the gifts from the Amazonian forest that we kind of sometimes, maybe if you live in Sao Paulo or if you live in the south of the country, you might not even notice that you really depend on the forest to have rain. And when there is deforestation, there is drought in other places because of these like flying rivers that bring water from the forest, from the evapotranspiration of the forest to other areas of the country. And the kind of the delicate social biodiversity, the linked livelihoods that exist in the Amazon connected to the diversity of the forest that are being damaged with all this. So what Andrea was talking about, the collective well-being, the place-based livelihoods of indigenous peoples and traditional communities that are reinventing development under all this pressure and the destruction that is going on. forming new social movements and collectives to resist to the situation that they are faced with. That is another very, very serious problem that we have, an emergency. This is all a part of an emergency situation, right? Of the savanization of the Amazon, that scientists predict that in 20 or 30 years, we are, or maybe less because of all the interconnections in the system, a risk of desertification of the Amazon being transformed in a desert and a savanization of the tropical forest. So this is something we heard about in the 80s maybe, and we were like, oh, okay, it's far. No, it's not gonna happen, but it's like now it's knocking on our doors. So I'm gonna refer to these books and the creation of this imaginary around environmentalism that has been created, and as Andrea referred to. And these books are very interesting to analyze from an anthropological point of view. It's called the Green Mafia. So the idea, or like a conspiracy theory, that environmentalists, including a lot, so in this constructed story, everyone that is an environmentalist goes to the same, it's put in the same box, right? So the idea is that these groups, or any environmentalist NGO, will be secretly working with powerful international agents that wish to explore Amazonia's richness and minerals, such as Andrea mentioned, and the construction of the social imaginary around this idea with books and of environmentalism, the new colonialism, and things like that. But there is really no scientific evidence of that. And there are very strong accusations. If you go online, you can look and you can see, for example, Neymar being criticized for being, supporting WWF, WWF being accused of being together with the British government for the exploitation of the Amazonian minerals. But who is really exploiting the Amazonian minerals? Maybe Andrea can help us to answer this question later. And then meanwhile, while all of these accusations and the kind of distractions are going on, we have some, testimonies, we have some talks by President Bolsonaro in Davos, and then more recently at the United Nations. In Davos, President Bolsonaro mentioned to Al Gore that he would like to explore Amazonian richness and resources together with the US. So I don't understand, where is the Mafia Verde here, right? The Green Mafia. And then also recently in September last month, President Bolsonaro's discourse at UN mentioned, in his discourse, he mentioned that indigenous peoples and smallholders are responsible for the Amazon fires, which is really a misinformation because it's coming from the agribusiness, the expansion of cattle ranching and soil plantations that are encroaching into the indigenous lands, illegal deforestation, and that's kind of the main cause of the fires, along with climate change as well, that is exacerbating the situation. So I bring the Constitution again, the article that Andrea already mentioned, that everyone has the right to an ecologically balanced environment, good for the common use of the people and essential to a healthy quality of life, imposing on the public power and the collectivity the duty to defend it and preserve it for present and future generations. So this idea of intergenerational justice. I'm almost finishing here. I brought this also as an example of something that is very recent. So because of that, Brazil being considered that is really inflicting the constitutional rights and disrespecting the constitutional rights of all Brazilians with the omissions and with the dismantling of environmental institutions, there was a lawsuit by a group of legislators, and the lawsuit went to the Supreme Court because of negligence of the country in implementing the climate policies and environmental policies in general. So in this hearing, a lot of different stakeholders or a lot of different actors were heard by the Supreme Court. Minister Barroso here is the judge. and including the executive power that was represented by General Augusto Heleno here, who mentioned that there is no scientific evidence that the fires occurring in the Amazon forest result from federal government inaction. In reality, they are connected to natural phenomena on which human action is incapable of preventing. Also, on the topic of global warming, this is discussed by famous scientists with antagonistic theses. So it's still the climate change denial here, and the kind of the thought that we are incapable of preventing. And I would say that we are not incapable of preventing. We are actually addressing and preventing through different actions by local people, indigenous firefighters that have been working day and night to address these fires in the middle of a pandemic. So it's really an urgent situation. And then finally, with the idea of climate injustice, so tying all this with climate injustice, all that's going on, the deregulation, the dismantling and all that. The uneven distribution of costs and benefits of the climate change, we are already facing that in Brazil, from emissions to sea level rise to deforestation. And of course, indigenous peoples, local communities, and the people who are least responsible for climate change, on the contrary, act as a buffer for climate change. Those are suffering already its gravest consequences. So why should we mind what climate responsibilities do we, current generations, have to future generations? And then I want to add to Andrea's question on the scholarship. We that are in academia, we are creating knowledge and we are sharing knowledge. So what is our responsibility? What are some research and action priorities regarding this topic in Brazil and elsewhere? And I just finished with this. Thank you very much. And I think we are now going to questions and answers. And I would like to share that moment with Andrea for questions from the audience.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you. I'm going to just say a few transitional words, and then we've got some questions queuing up in the Q&A. And then we'll put you both, I'll come off screen and put you both on the screen so that you can answer them. I want to say both of your talks were incisive and stirring and really quite remarkable. I want to just say a paragraph or so, just a few short notes I scribbled here before I give everyone else the stage that they deserve. So, Andrea, you said something that struck me. We have an obligation to bear witness. We as academics, but we as human beings have an obligation to bear witness. And I think your talk and Simone's talk also emphasizes that bearing witness must include a deep questioning of the a prioris that shape even our best intentions. We're not simply here to cry out Jeremiads about the world that's endangered, but to question our own presuppositions, coming as I do from the global north, from the global west, and occupying positions of security in comparison to the people who are, as Simone said, most endangered by the crises unfolding. You know, we have to call into question fundamentally, those of us that work in the environmental humanities, environmental studies more generally, the language of sustainability, wise development, good governance, costs and benefits, right? And maybe democracy itself, or at least how it's been implemented within the existing systems. We have to bear witness to the narrowness of our concepts of shared responsibility and mutuality, of participation, as Andrea said, by so-called stakeholders, when all of that participation is grounded on the logic of the fait accompli, the damage already done, on compensation and mitigation, without ever asking, should we dig a mine here, or should we build a dam here, or should we even be here? And without radical engagement with ethnic cultural plurality and recognition of the possibility that the forest is not just a standing reserve to be exploited, and without wrestling with collective well-being in all its messy diversity and alterity, we won't be able to question those a prioris. We will come in always trying to repair the damage done rather than rethinking the terms of our promise to others to help them survive that damage never questioning ever the foundations of the actions and the political and economic systems that put that in place. I think that what I found really striking, Andrea, about your challenge to us, I'm going to assume most of the members of this audience, sympathetic with environmental justice and sympathetic with environmental recovery, remediation, repair, and the salvation of our fellow human beings and other living beings that are being damaged by the crisis underway. Unless we call those things into call the presuppositions of how we think about those things, we may be aiding, without meaning to, the emergency of the conversion of slow violence into mere violence. This is a very challenging question you've posed to us. Well-meaning persons who want to save the world, to put quotation marks around it, there are alternatives, as you've pointed out. I mean, there are, especially among indigenous peoples who've been threatened, other ways of thinking about the relation to the natural world, and other ways of thinking about how to share its abundance, not its resources, its abundance, right? Its exuberance, its undisciplined beauty and power without exploiting those to ends. There are alternatives, but they're difficult. They're difficult to practice. And for many of us, they're difficult even to imagine. And that requires humility and compassion and long work. The times coming are going to require all of that of us, and of those that we train, and those that we mentor, and those who will have to carry that labor after we are done with it. I was very moved by these talks. Thank you very much for challenging me to think more critically about my own ways of understanding the nature of the crisis and its origins. I want to open it now to some questions that have been posed to you, and let you discuss them between yourselves. And I encourage the audience to continue to post these questions as we go forward, and to give you the opportunity to speak to one another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off camera now, but I will read the questions to you, and our tech support person will just have the two of you on the screen so that you may speak with one another, and then to our audience, who I'm sure has many important questions to ask you. So.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
So the first question comes from Robertson Azevedo. This is directed to Andrea. Do you think that local governments might play a role in protecting natural resources and people's interests, and should be considered as strategic actors?
Answer now, or?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Robertson. I really believe so. I think we will have elections soon, local elections, municipal elections in a few weeks' time. And I do believe that this is very important in order to make some changes in the compromise that governments would have with the people and the environment. So I think these are very important elections, considering the broader picture, political picture in the country and also internationally. So I believe that local politicians will have a very important role in this whole context nowadays. I didn't used to think about it before, but I think now, under the circumstances, I used to be very skeptical about elections for quite some time, and I didn't think it would make much difference voting, but at the moment I changed my mind completely. The situation, the situation of the world and of Brazil changed dramatically. So we do need to vote, and vote well, and vote for people committed to education, committed to equity. Yeah? Not only people committed to the growth, the big economic agenda development, which is a myth, development. But I do think that we need people committed to local initiatives and to social justice and education and health. Let's see what's going to happen soon.
Yes. I want to just mention on this question, I think the municipal level is the most local you get in terms of the policies and implementation. So it's a very important governance instance of governance. But there are some challenges, I think, in Brazil because for example, the indigenous lands are managed federally.
Yes.
So we have some kind of lack of connection. We have some scale issues in Brazil with those instances that we need to work on. And I have seen indigenous groups in the Xingu area where I worked for many years in Mato Grosso that they had very, very healthy relationships with the municipalities, but others no. So it's not everywhere, but in some places, they were able to have partnerships with the municipalities, and that worked well for them. So, I think that locally is where, the health systems happen, is where everything is going on. So I think it's a very important, but there are challenges to be overcome in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you, Simone.
Terry? Yeah.
I have another question. This is from Will Hasty, who has been with us this entire time. And he asked the question, what general advice would you give for the implementation of a or any so-called Green New Deal? How could such a deal go forward in a way that might avoid the pitfalls of the process that you're describing in environmental approaches in places like Brazil, or perhaps I would add more generally in the so-called developing world or in the global South? How do you feel about the concept of a Green New Deal? I noticed that Andréa was critical of certain cliches of its implementation, and I'd like to hear both of you speak about them in a way that that speaks to the challenges that it poses for the kinds of critical reflection that you've suggested to us tonight.
Well, thank you for the question. Very provoking. Well, it was provocative, my talk in that sense anyway. I know there has been criticism on the right side of the political spectrum, but my critique was about really the sort of heritage, or the colonial, so to speak, pitfalls of such initiatives when it's centered in economic growth. So the idea of economic growth is really something that is in the core of the problem when you have a deal or any kind of deal inside this perspective of environmental issues. So I don't really believe, for instance, in practices that are centered in the idea of development. I think that we need somehow to challenge some assumptions such as development, economic growth, the idea that we can share or we can distribute wealth in the world by economic growth, by constructing mining projects, responsible mining. There is no such thing as responsible mining projects. And I don't believe also in any kind of guidelines for good practices, for good construction of dams, hydroelectric power dams. I think that we shouldn't make any dams in the Amazon. There shouldn't be any dams in the Amazon, for instance. So I think that proposals, I think we need to be radical nowadays. Things are really going bad. So I believe that we must be more radical in our proposals. And I think we should look not only to science, but science to some extent need to speak and to have a dialogue with local sciences called local knowledge. Our system of domination don't call indigenous sciences as sciences. We call them indigenous knowledge, popular knowledge, or whatever, but we don't call it science. But there are systems of knowledge that we need to be open to it, to them, and open also to new forms of engagement with nature, new forms of producing our social relations. So I don't believe that we can reach any agreement, any deal, if if it prevails the consumption of our society, Western society. So I think that knowledge, technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, Western knowledge is important. I don't disregard technology as such, but I think efficiency, technical efficiency, is only one part of the thing. It's necessary, but it's not enough to stop deforestation or to address climate change properly. So we need to have a very, very big structural change in the way people live and relate to each other and to nature and in society. So consumption needs to be addressed, the high consumption. If you ask me, how can we change, how can industry, corporations change their practice if in the core of their existence, they need to produce and they need consumers to buy more and more things. So I don't really know. I wouldn't have an advice as such, Will, but I would say that we need to look to other alternatives outside of our Western system of thinking and of producing initiatives. I think that local people, indigenous peoples, they are addressing these issues successfully. So we must respect their ways of life, and we need really to consider that some spaces in the world, they are not for our consumption. We need to declare, as we say, territories free of mining, free of dams. We need to really have that in our agenda, that some places they need to be protected as such. They cannot be served for production and consumption in the capitalist way of doing things.
Thank you, Andréa. I couldn't agree more with Andréa on this. We don't need to apply the same indicators and the same metrics to look and to classify how developed a nation is or not, because we need new forms of relationships. We need to think in a global way, to be connected, because we are sharing, but much, much more looking at the local level in terms of like, what are the local priorities? What is the local knowledge that is there? What are the local resources? And how it should be used, not to attend to the market needs, but to attend to people's needs, and in a way that it can respect also the limits of nature. I think we need to reevaluate our values. Economic value cannot be the value that is above all of the other values. There are so many values that we have, values of our interactions with each other, values of our reconnections and relationships with nature, that we are pretty much as nature, we are nature. So I think that in a Green Deal, a new Green Deal, which we want it or not, it's going to be here. It is a reality. So we want it or not, the new Green Deal, it's coming, right? But I do agree that we need to reevaluate the values that we are going to be cherished. For example, you look at the Amazon in the 70s and the Amazon now. What happened with development in the Amazon? The Amazon, a lot of the richness of the Amazon is being exploited. We have maybe a very strong agribusiness going on in the Amazon, but the people are poor. We are exporting food to feed 2 million people in Brazil, 2 billion people. And the government is very proud that we are feeding 2 billion people. But our people are hungry. We have food insecurity, high levels of food insecurity. So we can't have a Green Deal, a new Green Deal with hunger and food insecurity. So we need to change the principles and the rules of engagement and be open to more creative ways and other philosophies, other parameters of the good life, other parameters of development, such as the buen vivir, such as other that is based upon other values than not economic growth. They are based on living well with each other and with nature, for example. And this really comes from the indigenous philosophies from the Andes and in the Amazon, and is being already implemented in so many places. But it's important that we also think that there is no like one size fits all or one solution. It's just this like quest for solutions that make sense and need to be built with the people.
Thank you, both of you, for that wonderful observation. I have an observation from a speaker who's also asked a question, but I'm going to lead with his observation that came a little later in the chain. This is Alfredo Supia. He says, native Brazilians have been around for a long time. They're totally adapted to the environment. Their systems of knowledge cannot be underestimated. I think that gets to the core of what you've been talking about. You know, local knowledge is global knowledge and vice versa, just as global justice is local justice and vice versa. I think those are very powerful observations. I want to go directly to his question, though, and we have a couple more lined up after this. So this is Alfredo Supia again. Considering the invasion of military personnel in both scientific institutions in Brazil, for example, the National Institute for Space Research, the INPE, how do you see our near future in terms of monitoring deforestation? What other means or resources we will have? NASA, how to keep an eye and bear witness if they blind and silence us?
You want to answer first, Andrea?
I
need to answer.
Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question, but I think that we should really align ourselves to people on the ground. There are several organizations working on the ground, working in the region with their means, not necessarily technological, but also technological. So we need to really listen to the people on the ground. That's the only thing I can say. We need to listen to the organizations which are working on the field, and they know what's going on. And I think that we have to listen and to speak to them. They are not blind, and they have a voice. We have to perhaps to spread their concerns and what they say. I don't really think that this situation will last long. I'm very optimistic somehow too. I hope that reason will prevail somehow in these institutions and science, and we are all engaged as researchers and as scholars in defending the university and the freedom of research and of producing data and of speaking about the results of our research. And so I think it's a struggle. I don't think they are completely dominating everything. I really think that this is a difficult time we are going through, but yeah, we need. This is politics. This is the political process. We need to fight back and to gain back the institutions we have built for decades. The Brazilian institutions, the Brazilian society have built these institutions, so they cannot be dismantled like that. The present moment could leave us some kind of how can I say, some setbacks or some difficult things, but I think we can overcome. This is the struggle. nothing is lost. This is the struggle that is going on at the moment. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I just want to compliment. I want to say also that a lot of indigenous communities now in the Amazon, and several of them, are monitoring their own territories. And they have their own data also, access, and they're keeping their data. They're using drones. So, I see a lot of like indigenous communities in Rondônia, for example, they're using drones. Uruê, several invasions a couple of weeks ago. And the leader was sharing what they are doing, both to stop the fires with like the brigadistas, like the indigenous firefighters and groups, and really volunteer work. None of these people are being paid to do that. And a monitoring of their lands using partnerships, but also their own technology, access to technology, indigenous, young indigenous persons, both men and women, that are now having access to these technologies and using for monitoring their territories. And then the other thing is that we continue to have independent institutions, independent NGOs, the same NGOs, they're criminalized. They're saying that they are, reserving the Amazon for the miners of the England miners that are coming to take our minerals. So a lot of these NGOs also keep independent monitoring systems and observatories. And I think the observatories are very important, which are these like broader set of people that share, that monitor the situation. And it's not only observatory of deforestation, but observatory of social justice. Also, we have several like that.
Sorry.
Yeah, the pandemic.
They have alternative rates, yeah.
Exactly. So independent monitoring, independent data is very strategic in this moment as well. Yeah.
Thank you both for that answer. I have a question now from Brooke Whitaker. She asks, what are some feasible ways of convincing governments to move away from the harmful ideas of development that you've talked about, Andrea and Simone? How can the general populace, that is, people who are not as trained and attentive to these matters as you are, be moved in a more radical direction to understand the need for degrowth, decolonization, and a change in our understanding of what is good development and sort of these other problematic concepts? How can governments be turned, and then I guess voters, I'm speaking for myself here, but I guess in these democracies, people who elect these governments, how can they be turned to reimagine the obligations that we have to the forest in general?
Well, can I start with this? Okay.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you very much for your question. I think that I really believe in the movement of people, in their organization of people. I don't think we can convince by word or by dialogue simply governments. They cannot be convinced rationally. I think it's by struggle, really. I believe in this, the force of the people, the movement of the people, and the organization of, it's a political move. It's a political process. So I think that it's a struggle. We have now elections as I said, for municipal elections. We have indigenous representatives running for local municipalities. We have Black people. We have representatives of slum communities, the favelas, or So I think that people are organizing themselves in so many different ways. And I do believe that this is the political debate, the political arena. It's the political arena that counts, not so much the intellectual reasoning. We won't convince any government with words, with ideas, as we don't convince corporations that they do harm to people and to the environment, they don't care about it. They don't really care about it. What they care is they want to profit from the business they do. So I believe that it's all within the political movement, the political arena in society. That's why politics is very important. In politics, in the wider sense of politics, in all senses of politics, very important to have a stand.
Yeah, I agree with Andrea, and I would add, there are many ways, Brooke. There are many ways that we can do this, and it's not going to be one generation. You know, I'm just going to share like a little story. I went to Palmas, and I was in an indigenous land of the Xerente people with some indigenous communities and representatives that came from the U.S. to Brazil to visit and have an exchange. And he was sharing a lawsuit that the people have, the Colville Confederate Tribes here of the United States had a lawsuit with the government that took 70 years. It's a life, okay? One lawsuit, 70 years to get the rights of their territories back. It took 2 generations. So it takes generations to do this. Maybe you're gonna live your whole life doing this, but then there will be someone else that will come after. So one thing is like keep the memory alive of all the injustices, all the violences, everything we went through. What Andrea brought us today, the story, the powerful story that Andrea told us today needs to be told. Everybody needs to be telling these stories. Everybody needs to be questioning development, where it comes from. It's invented. We take it for granted. So we really, it's called critical thinking, right? We go to the university to do critical thinking. We need to have more critical thinking. And there are other ways, learn from the other. For example, this idea to learn with other knowledges, other people, look at the other and question yourself. And then art. I think art is very powerful through the feelings. So also not only through the words, but through the feelings, through the senses. I think it's a powerful way to communicate these messages, Brooke. So in my view, there are many ways, but we need to keep our memory alive. It's painful, but it's very important. And I thank Andrea for bringing that story to us today.
I thank both of you. I think that's a wonderful note with which to conclude for this evening. Bearing witness across generations, there could not be a more powerful and important mandate to us as educators, as parents, as sisters and brothers, as beings living in the world, to bear witness to the wrongs that have been done, but with the hope that by patience and humility, we may learn to rethink the presuppositions that we bring to bear ourselves and that others bring to bear on us. I want to thank you both for a powerful, evocative, and deeply informative talks tonight. I know that I'm sure that I speak for the members of the audience who did not ask questions, and for those who will watch the video in the coming weeks and months after it is posted online, that you've given us reason to think both critically about our own a prioris and to think critically about what it is we mean to do when we mean to do good in the world and to help others do good. But you've also given us hope that with patience and with humility and with an eye to and a mind to the long arc of unfolding justice, that we could not merely reverse the damage that's been done, but reimagine a world in which we draw question to the actions that we would or should not have committed to begin with, right? That we draw questions to, as you said at the end, Simone, there, development and growth, as Andrea said. And by drawing attention to, questioning attention to those concepts, we could imagine a new world, a world that is more compassionate, more diverse, more inclusive, and more resilient in a way that is genuinely meaningful and not just a word that we bandy about with a little bit too much ease. So I thank you both for tonight's talks. I thank everyone for attending. And I remind you that we will continue these discussions with 2 new webinars next week, next Tuesday and Thursday. Please look to the Songs and ICC websites for the details. And we hope that many of you will join us then to continue these discussions into other arenas. Thank you again, Simone. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you everyone for attending tonight.